From Cafe and the Vox Media Podcast Network, this is Now and Then. I'm Heather Cox Richardson.
And I'm Joanne Freeman.
And welcome to this live taping. We are so excited to be joined this evening by our dear friend, the incredible Professor Carol Anderson, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. She's also the author of last year's terrific book, The Second: Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America.
Now, Carol joined us last October to talk about voting rights in the aftermath of the Brnovich decision, which pretty much gutted a lot of the power of the Voting Rights Act. And if any of you were there, it was a really lively conversation, really fun for us. And so it will definitely be fun for you again. She joins us now to talk about the recent mass shootings, the Supreme Court's rulings against gun control, and how the politicization of guns connects to the other pretty much anti-democratic shifts that we're seeing in American society now. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just looking so forward to this conversation.
And before we start it, let me just remind people to put questions that you might have in the comments or in the chat function. And we're going to answer some of those at the end of the show.
And here we are at the start of the show. Well, go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say, let me start right off. And I have to confess that I have been waiting for this because everybody always asks me to explain the origins of the Second Amendment. And I know Carol has discussed this at great length in the book, The Second. And Joanne and I actually discuss this not infrequently off camera when we're by ourselves, as historians tend to do. And I think that you both have a lot to contribute to this. And I have a third vision, and I don't think any of them are incompatible. So why don't you, Carol, start by taking us through what exactly the Second Amendment is all about?
So I started this research with the killing of Philando Castile. And so here you have a Black man who has a license to carry a weapon with him, and the police officer shoots him dead simply because he has a license to carry a weapon. And the NRA went silent. And so pundits were asking, well, don't Black people have Second Amendment rights? And I thought, Lord, that is a great question. And it was one of the rights that I had not looked at previously. So I went hunting and went all the way back to the 17th century. And in there, I mean, I was in your bailiwick, and in there, I'm finding all of this fear of Black people, the fear of the enslaved, and the slave codes coming up about making sure that they were disarmed, that they did not have access to weapons, also making sure that free Blacks didn't have access to weapons, and also finding the love of the militia and the slave patrols, because they are what protected the white community from this Black threat. And so as I'm seeing the Constitution develop, and there's the Constitutional Ratification Convention in Virginia, and James Madison thinks he's done something, right? Because, he's crafted this Constitution, and he's like, whoo, got that thing through, Lord, yes. All we got to do now is just get it ratified. And Virginia's sitting there going, nah, I'm not feeling it. I'm just not feeling it. And it's Patrick Henry and George Mason, two key enslavers and anti-federalists, who come at him hard because of the power of the federal government in this newly crafted Constitution, and because the militia is put under the control of the federal government. And George Mason is clear, we will be left defenseless against the slave revolt, because under the feds, it's going to be, we have to deal with Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, who are like getting rid of slavery in their states. And so we can't count on them. We can't trust them to send the militia down to protect us. And so they started threatening to scuttle the Constitution. And if they couldn't scuttle it, they were going to have a new constitutional convention, which was the last doggone thing James Madison wanted.
So pretty much anybody, Carol.
Right.
So wait a minute. They literally were like, we're out of here if you mess around with this.
Oh yeah, they were really clear about that. But remember, they had played hardball before with the drafting of the Constitution itself. This is how we get the 3/5 clause. This is how we get the 20-year extension on the Atlantic slave trade. And this is how we get the fugitive slave clause. It is the South playing hardball, saying, US, you're on your own. We don't get to protect slavery. We don't get to enhance slavery. We don't get to empower slaveholders. Then peace out. And so it was that threat again. It was that threat of dismantling the United States of America over slavery. And so when James Madison goes to that first Congress and he's crafting the Bill of Rights, and one of the congressmen said he felt like he was haunted by the ghost of Patrick Henry as he's crafting this thing. You get a Bill of Rights that, when you think about it, the state cannot create a religion, support a religion. You get freedom of the press. You get the right not to be illegally searched and seized. You get the right to have a speedy and fair trial. The right to a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. That thing is an outlier in this larger bill. And that was the bribe to the South to not hold a new constitutional convention. And so sitting in this Bill of Rights is an amendment that is about denying Black people their rights, about denying Black people the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is about how do we contain and control this Black threat? How do we keep the white community safe from this threat?
Let me add to that. Just no, go ahead, Heather.
I want to ask you about the stuff that I'm always bugging you about, because so literally I get these questions all the time, and you two are the experts in the country on this. So just go ahead and say back to whatever you wanted to, Joanne, but I really love the way you talk about the Bill of Rights and what's really going on in that.
Which was going to be, we just segued to the same place, Heather. That's what just happened. Well, I wanted to, in a sense, build off something you just said, Carol. And that is, if you think about the Bill of Rights as something that came along because people were scared of federal power, right? They were for appeasing people. It's the one thing that the Anti-Federalists did that was concrete, that they suggested and that they got at the in the constitutional period at the ratification debates. They were very nervous about this new constitution was going to take all kinds of powers and they were going to lose all of these rights in one way or another. So they wanted a Bill of Rights to show where the government couldn't go beyond, basically. They wanted to restrain this brand new, far more powerful government. So on the one hand, first of all, that's important to notice because, the Bill of Rights is from people who already were a little bit nervous about what was coming, this brand new government. It makes perfect sense that they're saying, I don't know about the power of that. But equally, if not more important, if you think about in that context, what the main thing that people are thinking about is, they're not thinking, as we do today in a very modern sense, my rights, this is my right. They're thinking the government can't do this. I want this to put a wall up in front of the government. So the Bill of Rights, in a sense, is about restraining government, not about empowering citizens. And that's important because if you look at the idea of rights over the course of American history, it changes its meaning. And so, in time, it comes to be much more individualistic. These are my rights. But in the period we're looking at, the constitutional period, it's a response to a new powerful government. And it's far more interested in putting up a wall than it is in empowering people beyond what they already had and knew.
Right. So do you see the second as an outlier, Joanne?
I guess I don't know if I see it as an outlier but actually I was really intrigued and I want to hear more from you, Carol, about that. I never thought of it that way before because it feels to me like the same fear-born Bill of Rights moment, right? Like, oh, well, they can't take away our, freedom of speech. Well, they can't take away our right to a fair trial. And some of these are things that go back to the revolution that they were nervous about. So as the dynamics of that amendment, I don't think necessarily make it an outlier. But what you're suggesting, Carol, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is that because of the explicitly race-centered aspect of it, that's an extra layer that's worked into that amendment.
Absolutely. And that's the piece for me. And I understand the fear of a standing army. I understand that was back there. But when I'm reading through the Virginia ratification debates, and I'm seeing how much George Mason and Patrick Henry are pounding on the fear of a slave revolt and the absolute fear that you could not trust the federal government to send the militia down to protect slaveholders when the revolt came. And so this is where that dynamic is. And so this is about how do we contain and control, not a government, but the power of how do we contain and control these enslaved folks? How do we contain these Black folks?
So Carol, is this an early manifestation of states' rights knocked into the Constitution?
States' rights, that is a great question. Yeah, it could be. It really could be. It was this fear that you could not trust the federal government, but that tension had been there like for so long. I mean, that tension was there with the Articles of Confederation, that they didn't want a strong central federal government. And so you had each of these individual states acting like separate actors. And that thing was absolutely unworkable.
I think one way of thinking of that too is kind of relates back to what I just said, which is, it's not so much, hey, states, you have more power. It was scary national government, you're going to have limited power, right? And it depends on how you're going to use that. But I think, again, speaking as someone who works in early America on the founding period, the degree to which people are scared of things or talking about things or using words differently in ways that suggest things that are happening back then mean something really different from the way people interpret them today, that's important to know. And a well-regulated militia, that's very explicitly about the fact that in that period, a standing army is like the ultimate threat of a free country, right? And there's a new government, it's going to be powerful and nobody really knows how it's going to work. So yeah, we have to really be able to defend our militias. That would have been, these local militias would have been the equivalent of armies. that could stand up against a tyrannical national government. So that fear too is built into this.
So let me ask one more thing, and then we obviously have to move on, but I find this fascinating. Of course, they were all overreading the Greeks, and one of the things that this accomplishes by looking at, by creating well-regulated militias is it sort of harks back to the old Greek system, but it also says we don't have to come up with the money to put an army in the field. And we proved in the revolution that we couldn't actually do that. So I'm over here being an economic person, economic historian type going, well, maybe they were just cheap. Yeah. Is that part of it? Or is it more ideologically driven, or was that just an excuse for the ideology?
That's a great question. I think that part of what we're seeing is, one is that militia wasn't really effective in fending off a professional army. There were just these incredible reports about the militia not showing up when George Washington really needed them to.
That's fair,
right? Or the militia taking off running when George Washington really needed them to stay and fight. And so this was one of the reasons why Madison put the control of the militia, the arming and the training of the militia under the feds to beef that up, to get some kind of coherence and organization behind it. But what the Anti-Federalists saw was that you now have the federal government having control of these militias. And what does that mean? And so for some, it means that we're really moving towards a standing army. What it meant for these slaveholders was that we will not have control over our own state militia if the feds are in full control of this thing, when the enslaved come and get us, come after us. And so this fear, so one of the things that I really lay out in the book, the second, was the role of anti-blackness in driving the Second Amendment. That fear of how do we protect the white community from these folks who had the Stono Rebellion, from these folks who had numerous rebellions in Virginia and South Carolina. How do we defend ourselves? Because whereas the militia would take off running, you couldn't count on them during the Revolutionary War. You could count on them to put down a slave revolt. They were really good and really effective at that.
Okay, so you two have convinced me that the second is about walling off the federal government from stopping, from hurting people's individual, or not even hurting people's rights, or from defending white Southerners against their Black neighbors. And then, of course, that's overturned in 2008 by Heller, the Heller decision we'll get to, and nothing happened in between. Is that right, Carol? See, I love setting Joanne up like that.
She does. I was about to say, I am so enjoying watching Heather do that to someone else. I'm sorry, Carol, but I'm always
warn me.
The brunt.
You didn't warn me.
She did. She does almost every week. You do that, Heather. So then this happened, and everyone went home, right, Joanne?
And Joanne's over there like, no, Franklin Pierce.
There was so much that happened in between then and Heller. One of the things that you continue to see happening is the continued push to disarm Black folk, regardless of their legal status. So when they were enslaved, they could not have arms. When they were free Blacks, they could not have arms. After the Civil War, you get the Black codes, and one of the key elements in the Black codes is disarming the free people.
So stop just a minute there, because of course I love Reconstruction. Could you walk us through some of that? Because you have all these soldiers who go home, and they're trained soldiers, and they have their guns, and now they have civil rights, and by 1870 they're going to have voting rights. What happened?
Woo! And so again, what you see is coming out of Reconstruction. You see this language, this fear of armed Black people who are strutting around acting like they're citizens, acting like they're full-blown American citizens, acting like they're human beings. And it's like, we can't have this. And so you get the rise of these neo-Confederate governments that come in that Andrew Johnson had basically provided amnesty to. And they implement black codes. And black codes were a way to try to reinstall slavery by another name, to control the labor of the freed people, but also to control their lives, and also to disarm them because they've got these guns. And one of the things is like, when folks know they're free, they're like, I'm free. And you want to strip them of that freedom. They're like, we've got to take the arms away from these really dangerous, violent Black people. And so you continue to get the language of violent, criminal, dangerous happening when it comes to Black folk.
So literally, what did that look like? Did
it look like a slaughter?
I'm a soldier. I just got home. I've got my gun. I got my shack, whatever. Gangs of white guys come and drag me out and take my gun?
Yes. So you got these militias, not militias, you got these white domestic terrorists, such as the Ku Klux Klan and such as the red shirts and the white camellias, who are terrorizing these Black folks. The slaughter, Carl Schurz's travel log of atrocities, as he looks at the conditions in the South after the Civil War, from like mid 1865 to December 1865, and you just see the bodies being piled up, being burned, being hung, being dismembered. I mean, you just see torture and violence raining down on this Black community, because Black folks are standing up. Black folks believe that they have rights. And so I saw these missives coming out of the Black churches talking about, don't we have our Second Amendment rights? And the response, was no. It's like Amy Winehouse, so we're switching generations here, but it was Amy Winehouse going, no. And so you hear these plaintive wails going up to the Freedmen's Bureau, going, we have our Second Amendment rights. And the Freedmen's Bureau is like, this violence is a lot. I mean, it is a lot. And we just don't have the power to stop it.
And America, has a long tradition of violence in one way or another as political repression, and really no response, right? I mean, that's the sort of stuff that I do in my work, and particularly race-centric, right? So it's not as though suddenly governments are like, you know what? Ethos of the time. Oh, I'm sorry. Heather is like, are you leaping in?
Only because you froze. Keep going.
Oh, okay. Yikes. Okay. Yeah. Why is that the case? I'm not the one that's supposed to be freezing. I even got lost about what I was saying.
But this political violence, and an ethos of not responding, particularly when it's racialized.
Right. Exactly. That a certain amount of violence is seen as fair or just, depending on who's doing the punishing. And the other thing worth remembering here is that on a local level, the way that this kind of violence works is that if you have some really over-the-top, nasty, violent, horrible punishments, not only are they punishing and destroying bodies and lives, but they stand there as repressive reminders. Right? Yes. You don't want to do what we just punished that person for doing. Yes. So, you can have all your claims you want about your rights. You're not going to want to demand them after you see these sorts of things.
So after the Colfax massacre in Louisiana, which the U.S. Supreme Court then overturned the Force Act and said, no, the federal government cannot stop white domestic terrorism because these are private acts, and the Force Act can only go against state acts. And then after the Hamburg massacre in 1874 in South Carolina, again, a slaughter. President Ulysses S. Grant was just beside himself. And he said, you know what these states all have in common? It's not Christianity. It's not civilization. It is the right to kill Negroes. basically without any accountability and without any consequences. I've added that extra piece on. I paraphrased his last piece, but he was talking about being able to slaughter Black folks without accountability, without consequences.
Can I ask you this? When you talk about the taking away of guns and the fear of this constructed Black criminal,
Mm-hmm.
and this speaks to your work, Joanne, as a person who looks at the social background of politics and violence, and of course to yours as well, Carol. Is that part of what's driving the concept of Black Americans and Indigenous Americans in the same period as criminals? The idea they're criminals? You have to construct criminals in order to take their guns away?
I think for what I'm seeing is the need to construct them as violent and as criminal and as a threat in order to justify what's being done to them, in order to justify enslaving them, in order to justify lynching them, in order to justify removing them from their land.
I was about to say, taking their land, right?
Right.
Well, they're horrible, they're violent, right? They're savages.
Yes.
And so, they're going to kill us. And so we're defending ourselves by pushing them out and taking their land. So it makes you the sort of virtuous, I'm defending myself person.
Right.
And sort of, takes in a sense, it's low ground, but it feels like or sounds like it's the high ground.
Yeah. It's a linguistic twist that is really powerful even today.
I was going to say, I hate how much this echoes. I just hate how much this echoes.
So what is going through your head, Heather? What echoes are you talking about?
Well, many things, because the whole idea that I'm playing in Reconstruction here, the idea that, for example, we in America have tended to talk about young Black Americans and young Indigenous Americans as adults from extraordinarily young ages, whereas white guys can be children. I mean, when we talked about Donald Trump Jr. as a child, how do you do? And it's like, wait a minute, isn't he like in his 40s?
40s?
And then we've got, a 14-year-old who is killed as an adult. It's like that whole sort of reordering of American society according to how dangerous you are. That's why I asked the question about about whether the criminalization to take guns away is in part sort of constructed this whole, they're dangerous from the time they can walk. I mean, literally, all those horrible things people said about Indigenous Americans as well.
Yes.
It's just interesting how the guns fit into it.
Yes, because it's, for me, one of the things about the role of anti-blackness is that once you have defined Black folks as criminals, as a threat, as inherently violent, then adding guns makes that violence exponentially. They become an exponential threat. And again, this is something we're seeing carrying through even today.
So what about there are a couple of things I wanted to make sure that you touched on, and obviously we haven't gotten to the present yet, but we're not talking about at all is women. And you had some wonderful examples in your book of women who stand their ground, and it works out great.
Okay, you were prepared this time,
That's
Carol.
Right, that's right.
No, it doesn't. So part of what we see is I'm going to go more contemporary now with women standing their ground. Think about Marissa Alexander, who was the Black woman in Florida around about the same time as Trayvon Martin. And she had been a victim of domestic violence, and she had just had a baby, and her partner came at her, threatening her. She's running for her life. She gets the gun out of her car in the garage and goes back into the house and shoots a warning shot to tell him to back off. She didn't shoot him. She shot a warning shot. She got hit with a 20-year sentence. So clearly, in a stand your ground state where you have documented domestic violence, a Black woman protecting herself by
And her baby
by shooting a warning shot. She didn't have that right to defend herself. And then I juxtapose that to George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, where, again, a stand your ground state, where you have Trayvon, who is a child. He's 17, but in the media, he gets thugified. He gets heavier, taller, darker, more malicious, more yeah,
right?
hood.
Yeah.
Yeah, the hood, and you have a grown man who sees this Black child and says, threat to my community. And so he gets a loaded weapon. Zimmerman takes a loaded weapon and stalks this child through the neighborhood. But the way that it plays out is that Zimmerman, the grown man with the loaded gun, is the one who was fearful. And Trayvon was the threat. And so killing him was okay because he was a threatening, vicious, thugified, drug smoking, dangerous Black man. That was the way that it played out in the thugification of Trayvon Martin.
What year was that?
2012, I want to say. I'm a historian who's bad with dates.
I always say the same thing. I always say I'm bad with names and dates, and that's why I'm a historian.
And that's why I asked, because we should all know. And I was going to say 2014, and I don't think that's right. I think that's too late.
Yeah, because I think Michael Brown was 2014. Yeah.
But so this guy one of the things that interests me about all this is that you are looking at anti-blackness, and Joanne really focuses on violence and how you consolidate power through violence. And I really look at the construction of political imagery. And one of the things that jumps out to me here for all of this work is it seems to me we are in different periods constructing a vision of America as being about one guy with all these rights defending himself and theoretically his family from that dangerous other. Yeah. And that, of course, brings us to this current moment, which I think, Joanne, that's fair to say that that's kind of what was going on in the American South in the 1850s, right?
This fending yourself off from the dangerous other. Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, it becomes very important. In a sense, it's part of your justification for being violent and aggressive and attacking is if you define it as being defensive, right? Well, they're out to get me in some way. They're coming, I remember in my most recent book, there's someone who reaches out to Masons and says, look, we're the Masons and we're all over the place and we're a brotherhood and we could talk to each other and
we're all over the place.
Okay, maybe he didn't put it that way. That's my some paraphrase.
I get it.
Yeah, paraphrase.
I know, and they are all over the place, and we are true to each other, and we can talk to each other, and we can sort of bring down the tone of things. This is like 1858 or 9, and someone responds to the letter in which this person is pleading, and says, "Are you kidding? I mean, are you really kidding? You think I'm going to listen to this? You guys are about to come into my home and burn down my house and take my family. I don't care. Why am I listening to you? This is life and death." Right now, at that point, that's not happening. But that person who responds is totally in, defense moment. So anything goes. Yeah. And sometimes that's the best way to justify violence. And it's not necessarily that people think, time to justify violence. I think I'll make myself be defensive. But that dynamic is really important. Yeah. No one, you always want to depict yourself as the victimized, virtuous person under attack, and thus anything that you do is justifiable.
And to me, this is why when we're seeing the horrific evolution of the Second Amendment, so it was bad enough as its anti-blackness core continues through with the well-regulated militia. But watching the Heller decision of the US Supreme Court in 2008, and then the McDonald decision in 2010.
Wait, stop. Walk us through Heller.
Yeah. So Heller comes out of Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. had really strict gun safety laws that dealt with how you had to maintain your gun within your own home, because they knew that there was lots of violence in the home with weapons. And you had this case then where the US Supreme Court looks at this and says, the US Supreme Court cherry picked some history and came up with this founding fathers individual right to bear arms. And anybody who does the real work in this period knows that that Second Amendment was about the well-regulated militia. It wasn't about an individual right to bear arms. But now the US Supreme Court, based on bad history, has created a judicial standard that you have this individual right to bear arms. But because that was Washington, D.C., it dealt with on a federal basis. And so then the McDonald decision in 2010 dealt with Chicago. And then that made it across the United States. And again, this individual right to bear arms.
And wait, McDonald, walk us through McDonald.
Oh, McDonald had the same kind of really stringent laws about the right about carrying guns, about how you could carry them, what you needed to be able to carry them in your home, with how you had to have them in your home. It had all of those restrictions around that, again, to lessen the access to guns, because what we know is that it is this vast proliferation of weaponry that leads to our large homicide rates. And so how do you bring down the homicide rates? One is that you restrict the access to the guns that help lead to this high homicide rate. Boy, if I had a student who wrote that sentence, I was like, no. But
there were lots of good H's in it.
Yeah, lots of H's, right? And
alliteration counts for a lot.
And so, but what this individual right to bear arms, when you read through those decisions, what they keep harping on is that you have the right to self-defense. It is the right to self-defense. And so it's crafting a really hostile world where you have to, when you're outside of your home, when you're inside your home, you've got the castle doctrine, defend yourself. When you're outside your home, anywhere you are, which is part of stand your ground, anywhere where you have a right to be and you perceive threat, you have the right to defend yourself. So this crafting, this ratcheting up of the fear of being in American society, that you have to always be on guard, that you always have to know that you are under threat. And then is the way that this society defines threat. So after Uvalde, right, the slaughter of those children and the 2 teachers in Texas, when folks are like, so let me see if I get this right. He turned 18 and he had immediate access to AR-15s. And so Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, was like, don't talk to me about our laws. What about Chicago? What about Chicago? And so, right, Chicago. And that's the kind of, Ian Haney Lopez talks about dog whistle politics. That is dog whistle politics. Chicago is, think about all of those Black folks there in Chicago who are violent. They have this huge homicide rate. They're just, and it's that imagery of the slaughter, the imagery of Black violence, the imagery of Black threat.
And justified violence and Black threat because it's defensive.
Yes.
Right? It's defensive. How could I not do this? It's defensive. Like, that's part of the logic here, right? It's twisted. We all use that word, but that's part of how it's being reasoned.
Think about Bernard Goetz in New York City in 1984, I want to say it was. Again, don't quote me on that date. And he was on the subway, and there were 5 Black teenagers who asked him if he had $5 or if he had a cigarette or something like that. And he pulls out a gun and he shoots all 5 of them.
I remember.
Yes.
I remember too.
Yes. Yes. And you got this thing where he became a hero because he took on the threat of these 5 Black teenagers who were unarmed. but he dealt with that threat and he walked. The jury said, yeah, you had the right to be afraid.
I want to ask both of you a question. And I guess in part because I'm asked a version of this all the time about January 6th. Given, Carol, the work you do, and also, Heather, all of the ways in which you're talking about the framing and context of the current moment, let's get specific, actually. What was your response, Carol, and also Heather, when the decision came down about guns and that series of decisions? Carol, did you have a particularly distinctive, other than strong response? How did you respond as a person who works on this?
The New York State, the Bruen decision?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought a couple of things. One is that given where you had the Republican National Committee, the head of it, Ronna Romney McDaniel, saying that January 6th was legitimate political discourse. So that violence was legitimate political discourse. And then when you think about Reuters did that analysis of the threats going into election officials and election workers from the 2020 election, and how many times you had the Second Amendment invoked as the way to deal with these folks who stole the election.
It's right on Reconstruction.
It really is. It really is. And so seeing the New York decision, I went, this is further down that slope. I've talked about how American democracy is under a full-blown assault. The land assault is the attack on our voting rights. And so we're seeing state after state after state implement much more barriers, more hurdles for access to the ballot box based on the big lie that this was a stolen election. The second assault is the sea assault, where we're getting the wiping away of American history, the teaching of real American history. And so we don't, where you don't talk about slavery, you don't talk about the genocidal removal of indigenous people, where you don't talk about xenophobia and the anti-immigrant strain coming through American society.
And the separation of church and state, apparently.
Woo! Okay, you don't talk about any of that. No, you made some stuff up that separation of church and state wasn't even in the Constitution. And so you see, so that to me, that is the sea assault. When you wipe away American history, then you can craft your own narrative, your own self-serving narrative that deals with the relationship of people to power, and that deals with who's in and who's out. Who are the others, who are the makers and who are the takers. And then to me, there is the air assault. And that air assault is the loosening of these gun laws. We already saw it before the Supreme Court decision in Texas and in Georgia, where you could get permitless carry, where you didn't have to have any real training. And then you have the Supreme Court's decision that basically says, you've got the right to carry a weapon outside of anywhere you are that isn't sensitive. And we don't think of a lot of places that you're defining as sensitive as being really sensitive. And so when you link that in with the political violence that has already been demonstrated against election workers and already demonstrated in January 6th, we are in a heap of trouble. That's what I thought.
And my reaction is, I agree with that. I think as you know, I agree with the idea we're in a terrible crisis here. But one of the things that was interesting about the Bruen decision, which came down at the end of June and overturned a New York State law about whether or not people had access to guns under certain circumstances, is that New York promptly passed a whole slew of far tighter regulations than were there before, and so did New Jersey. And when you combine that with the fact that out in California, the governor, Newsom in California, has all of a sudden been really ramping up California doing whatever it wants out there. I think today he announced that they are going to be manufacturing their own insulin. One of the things that is and of course going to be a state where people can continue to get abortions and all sorts of things that other southern states and some of the western states are not permitting. It really makes me wonder, and to take us back to where we started, about how this moment is going to play out. That is, when the Supreme Court that we have now, which has been utterly radicalized with these 6 people from the Federalist Society who want to throw everything back to the states, they're clearly trying to kill business regulation and the protection of civil rights and a basic social safety net. But at the same time, just like in the years before the Civil War, what that means is that states can do whatever they want. And New York has just basically said, hey, we're really cracking down on gun ownership. So has New Jersey. California has said, hey, we're going to have abortion rights out here. And when you think about this moment, dear God, doesn't that look like the 1850s? And the difference between then and now is that then the enslavers, the large enslavers who basically ran the U.S. economy, were all in the South. So they were like, we'd love to just go make our own country because we're the ones with all the cash. And although it wasn't really cash, it was they didn't have a lot of cash. They had property and all that. But now it's the blue states that are the economic engines. And I don't think those red states are going to say, yeah, it's okay if you go off and do your own thing. I think they want to have their minority rule, not to create their own little minority fiefdom, but to impose it on the majority. And this is an entirely new moment. And that dynamic of we're focusing on the states who aren't going to have rights, but what about the states that are going to have expanded rights? And how does that play out? Does somebody in Mississippi go, hey, Massachusetts is looking pretty good over there? And then somebody in Mississippi says, well, you can't go because we need workers. We've been there before, too.
Yes, we have.
Well, go ahead.
We were there with the Great Migration. When Black folks were fleeing the South because of the lynching, because of the lack of education, because of the lack of economic opportunity. There were cities that were passing laws saying that Black folks could not leave for economic opportunity. They couldn't leave to get a better job.
And the same was true after 1876, where there were literally labor conventions that said you couldn't, that a white guy couldn't hire a Black person away from a neighbor.
Yeah, right. I mean, so you think about how we talk about how capitalism is this on high, held up on high, this enshrined thing, except when it isn't. Except when, when labor, one of the key laws of capitalism is labor has the right to take itself where it can get the best deal. Except when you get these rules put in place saying, no, you can't leave. And so what they were doing during the Great Migration was saying, if you try to leave, we will criminalize you. We will incarcerate you. And then we will put you basically on a work farm. So it was, we're going to extract your labor 8 ways to Sunday, come hell or high water. We're going to extract your labor and you cannot leave for the American dream.
What I was going to just throw in there is people not being able to leave states or go to other states is the most obvious thing in the world, which is abortion, right? And that there we have basically in one way or another, in some states, they're talking about making it so that you can't leave to go to another state to get an abortion, right? Which is, first of all, remarkably, I don't even know, I don't have a word actually for that as to what that means and what that entails and how anyone could possibly do that. But, it's like the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Where
yes,
the North, slaves would escape, enslaved people would escape from the South, they would go north. And the Fugitive Slave Act basically said, well, Northerners have to return those people to the South, and law enforcement has to help in that process. You can't help someone continue to escape. So what you have there in the 19th century is people fleeing from one state to another state for freedom, and people in the North being told, sorry, I know you like that kind of freedom here, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
We're going to take that back. We're in this moment, right, where women might go from a state that doesn't allow abortion to a state that does. And, what we hear these people talking about, essentially saying, no, I'm sorry, like, you can't go to another state. And if you're there, will you be allowed to have an abortion? Like, how will this work? It's, I suppose we've talked before, Heather, you and I, about how sometimes I'm the person like screaming with my hair on fire. This puts me in the screaming
historians are right now.
That is true.
Yes.
This is a screaming with my hair on fire
Yes.
kind of moment, because even though I understand the logic of it and we've seen it coming bit by bit, and as historians we could predict parts of it, living through it and watching it happening, it sucks. It totally sucks. I wasn't going to quite say that, but I'll take it.
I'm sorry, it's an unfortunate moment in our personal existence.
That's how I always write. I'm always like, it's unfortunate that it does suck.
So to go back though, where I'm going to transition us into people's questions to get back to the gun issue, which is so incredibly important right now. Mm-hmm. And somebody has asked a question that I would love to hear Carol talk about, because it's a biggie, and that is,
before we go to questions, let me just weigh in really briefly. You told me to do this, and
I did.
Okay, so we are going to segue to questions after airing tonight. After airing tonight, this question and answer portion is going to be released as part of what we call our backstage segment. And what that means is that subscribers to Cafe Insider have access to backstage. It's a conversation weekly. Usually Heather and I continue what we're talking about in the episode, but in a much more personal and informal manner. And you have exclusive access to that if you subscribe to Cafe Insider. And you can find backstage in the Cafe Insider feed. So, and I even have this here, because I would never remember it. Just visit cafe.com/insider. I feel very official now.
Well, I was gonna say, and you're totally right. Just this conversation is so fascinating. I honest to God, completely forgot we were doing a show. So yes, thank you. And I'm sorry I did not put that in there. Carol.
Yes.
Black Panthers. Everybody loves that they're carrying guns. Hey, could you insert them into this whole thing? Because, of course, isn't that how we get a real change in the way we understand guns in the period?
Oh, my gosh. And so think about the civil rights movement, and then we move into to that era of the 1960s. And what you have happening is massive police violence raining down on Black folks in Oakland. And that there is no responsiveness from any of the political leaders to dealing significantly with that police violence raining down on the Black community. So the Panthers come together, the Black Panthers come together, and they say, we are going to police the police. We are going to provide defense to the Black community. And that defense is not shooting cops. That defense, though, is standing there and monitoring what the cops are doing, and California had open carry laws. And so the Panthers knew the laws. The Panthers knew what kinds of guns they could carry. They knew how they were supposed to carry them. They knew where they could point, where they couldn't point. They knew all of the rules about how far to stand away. The cops hated it. From the depths and the breadths and the heights that their soul shall reach, the cops hated having the Panthers sitting there watching them, monitoring them. And so the police ran to Don Mulford, who was a conservative legislator in the California Assembly. And they said, we need your help, because every time we pull the Panthers over, they're not doing anything illegal. I mean, everything they're doing is within the law. We need to make what they're doing illegal. And Mulford said, I got this. And with the help of the NRA, he began crafting the Mulford Act that dealt with making illegal the way that the Panthers carried guns to monitor the police. And Ronald Reagan said, I'm eagerly awaiting this bill to hit my desk so I can sign it into law. So the ways that we think about gun control, as the conservatives being against gun control, because these are the stalwarts of the Second Amendment, Eh, it depends on who's carrying the gun. that is the variable that matters here.
So how did that play out in the national conversation? So we do in fact get restrictions on gun carry,
Mhm.
and going forward though, I mean, I think that's the last time the NRA actually backed restrictions on gun ownership. Is that correct?
Yes, because from my
And they
understanding,
did back it.
they backed it. They backed the Mulford Act. And so, but you see that there's there's a change in leadership in the NRA in the mid 70s, and then and it really took off in the early 80s, where they became heavily politicized, and that this was really about, so even the motto of the Second Amendment that they have on their corporate headquarters, they took off the first piece of the right to a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. That part of the Second Amendment is removed, and it is the individual's right to bear arms shall not be infringed is what is highlighted as the Second Amendment for the NRA. But again, I look at this, I think about how the NRA went silent when Philando Castile was gunned down, but how they were absolutely vocal when Ruby Ridge and Waco jumped off, and you had basically white folks killing federal officers and federal officers shooting back. and the NRA called those federal officers jackbooted government thugs.
Yes, in that case, it was really striking how the government became the bad guys, despite the fact that there were government reports saying, yeah, they were actually doing what they were supposed to do.
Right. I mean, so this is the piece where you see the radicalization of the NRA, and you see it becomes very apparent how gun ownership is linked with white citizenship
and a political ideology.
And a political ideology.
And what that means then, given all of that, is that if someone talks about you not having a gun, not even all your guns, but one gun, or having some limits on guns, right, that becomes victimization. It becomes an attack. Again, this gets back to what I said before. It becomes something you have to defend against, because this is your right, and they're taking something away that you're due. And of course, virtuous me needs to stand up and demand what I need to demand. It's a really effective rhetorical place to stand. It's a hard one to counter, which is why right now, we sort of live in an age of victimization culture. But this is, again, that same kind of logic.
Right. I mean,
well, there's that weird idea that if there's any kind of gun safety legislation, it means that everybody's going to lose all their guns, and that's of course not all what it means.
Right. There's like a knee-jerk jumping, right? Yep. If anyone says, let's just make it so that you can't this kind of gun, or let's just make it that you have to be this age, or that there's a leap from that to they're going to take all our guns.
Yes.
And there's no gray area in any of this.
And I don't know about you, Carol, but I grew up, I know Joanne didn't, I grew up around guns. I'm totally comfortable with guns, but not AR-15s. It's a whole different world than it was when we were growing up.
Right. And I mean, but this is the thing, it's like how you see politicians holding semi-automatic weapons as That's part crazy. of their political ads. Vote for me because I will hunt these rhinos, right? Vote for me so I can kill these Democratic Klansmen. Vote for me.
That was today.
Woo! And so begin to think about, this is where political violence becomes normalized.
Ideology. This is violence and victimization as ideology.
Yes.
Okay, so we have a bunch of great questions and we're running out of time. So can we play a version of Jeopardy? Because I want to hear some of these answers here. Okay. And first one.
Yikes.
Weren't there pretty strict gun laws when the Second Amendment was written? Joanne.
I don't know how strict they were, but there were laws. I mean, it's the same with abortion as well, where the bad history being done in some of these Supreme Court decisions are looking back in time and saying it's always been this way. This hasn't ever been regulated, or there has always been laws there in the case of abortion to make it illegal. People always hated it. And in essence, in these recent cases, none of that is true. We all know as historians, history is always a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than line drawing in that way. But it's really handy in Supreme Court decisions, apparently, to draw lines.
That's right, Carol, right? That there were actually gun ownership laws in colonial America, especially in the cities, right?
Absolutely. There were all, laws about what kind of gun you could have, who could have them.
Plus, they weren't very effective.
No, they really weren't. They didn't shoot multiple rounds in a minute, right? They were old. They were guns. They were like muskets. They were like these flintlocks where you had to, and then, it was right.
I have to say, I shot one, a black powder dueling pistol.
Okay.
And I, of course, I wouldn't expect my aim to be wonderful, but there was a sharpshooter member of the police force there with us, and he was having the hardest time aiming this thing, right? He would shoot it and we would all be like, so yeah, these guns were not the same thing as our current guns.
Right.
And they did take, as somebody who was skilled, it could take, about a minute to a minute and 20 seconds to load. And I've shot them not infrequently, and they do. There's a lot of steps to doing it.
Right.
And so that brings up somebody else's question. Weren't the militias really ineffectual? The militias in the wars of the 1790s were basically guys with guns and beer who liked to shoot at people, but were really bad at getting shot at. Is that correct? It sounds right to me. But
well, I would tweak that a little, which is, they were civilian militia organizations, local men who, mostly were armed, and they drilled. So it wasn't as though they were like guys with a beer saying,
one guy who's really good. And yelling at everybody else.
In the militia in New Haven, there's at some point I saw a list of the people in it, and there was someone who was just defined as an eccentric barber. But so, it was just the local people, but they were at least drilling so that if something bad happened, they'd have a clue what to do. This doesn't necessarily mean that they did it. But yeah, these are local people, getting together, and really, we better know how to do something in case we're attacked is what a militia is.
But one of the things you think about, like Shays' Rebellion, which blew up in Massachusetts, where you had folks attacking the government because they didn't like a tax policy. And so Massachusetts tries to call out the militia to deal with Shays' Rebellion. And the militiamen are like, nah, I'm not feeling this. In fact, I'm feeling Shay, right? And so you get lots of militia folks running over to Shay, and so the Boston merchants have to hire a mercenary army.
They create a private army.
Right, to take out Shays' Rebellion. So this was part of the milieu. Oh God, I hate that word. But this was part of the ethos that was happening at the time when the Constitution is being drafted. They're dealing with the militia really not being able to be reliable. They're also dealing with Shays' Rebellion and seeing that the militia just was like, yeah.
So that brings up the next question here. Is there a historical link between the militia and the police? How does one go to the other, or do they? Because a lot of people think the police come out of the slave patrols, and they don't. They're actually formed before that in the urban cities. Is that correct? Or is it wrong? Carrie, you're looking at me like, oh, no.
Yeah. So my colleague, Leslie Alexander, is actually working on that book right now.
You can use her as your lifeline. Give her a call.
Yo, Leslie.
This is not the show. Who is the weakest link?
Right?
I don't want to be playing that show.
Right? And so, but one of the things that to me is clear is the role of the slave patrols in being able to have the authority to track Black folk in order to be able to question Black folk. Why are you here? And to have that kind of authority, to be able to confiscate stuff from Black folk. All of that, to me, is reminiscent, emerges into the kind of policing ethos that we think of today. I mean, and it's part of what here in Georgia, where we had the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, who was the Black man running through a white neighborhood. Oh my God. And you had these white guys who believed that they had the right to track him down. That was a slave patrol mentality there. You know, he's not somewhere he's supposed to be, and we have the authority to basically
and that
whereas
maybe,
let me throw something really quick in. Whereas certainly in urban areas, police very often were not policing elite white men, right? Who would do something like duel, right? Which is against the law. And they would be like, well, I kind of heard that maybe, you know. So, you know, again, selective, really depending on who you are, and in a lot of ways, and just sort of determining in one way or another when something actually has an impact and is in power, and when it isn't, in a really selective kind of a way that can be easy to not see if you're looking back with a distance of history, but which is really there.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that what bothered me most about that case, aside from his murder, was the fact that, you know, there's always crap that goes on in a society, but one of the things that we have trusted at times in America anyway is that our legal system and the people involved in the legal system will bring those vigilantes, which is what they were, to justice. And honestly, you know, I dove pretty deeply into that case, and I was horrified at the phone calls of that between the prosecutor and the person involved in the shooting, and he had worked for her. And at the end of the day, no, you don't really have a case. There was a video which I watched, which is horrific. It is horrific. And to say, well, this just proves you're innocent. Had that man not tried to clear his name, the guy who was sitting in the truck not tried to clear his name and taken that to a radio station to put on their website, there would have been nobody who was brought to justice for that.
Exactly. I mean, and think about it. The police and the first two DAs saw that tape and thought, there's no crime here. It took activism. It took activists to just raise 10 tons worth of hell, to in fact generate enough publicity and enough concern about what had happened down there in order to get this case into a DA's office that was really going to do the work.
You know, it's a sort of gives me an idea, and I suppose we have run out of time, so we should sort of bring things to a close. But part of what I want to say here relates to much of what was said, and that is particularly in relation to this recent stream of Supreme Court's cases. It's easy for the implications and impact of some of this stuff to seem invisible, right? In history, when we look back, we have to look for it, and then we can see it. Or in this case, it would have been easy for this to vanish and we wouldn't know about it. So, you know, I always say to people, we're at this moment where the implications and the impact matter beyond the beyond, right? That you need to be aware of what's going on, thinking about the implications of what's happening, and thinking about real history and what happened in the past and how that can actually inform what might happen going forward. We really need to be alert and aware, and you just used the word active. We need to be activists to deal with this vision that's being sent out into the world about a kind of America that the majority isn't necessarily on board for.
Let's hand you the last word, Carol. What should we think about the second, and what should we do to try, and at least as a historian, I'm suggesting that we need to get back to a pre-Heller understanding of the second. But there was more to it in your book. You actually thought that the second, I believe, as I wrote to you after I read it, that you were making a much larger argument about American society when you wrote about the second.
Yes, and that argument deals with the way that anti-blackness is so embedded in the way that we operate in this nation. So it is the way that insurrection that happened on January 6th was basically provoked by saying that those people in Atlanta, in Detroit, in Milwaukee, in Philadelphia, stole the election from good, honest, hardworking white folk. And so because they stole it, we have to take our country back. That kind of anti-blackness that delegitimizes the citizenship and the humanity of folks who live here, who are American citizens, is so profound. It has major implications and repercussions for this democracy. We are teetering because we have not dealt with the anti-blackness. Part of what I've also argued about the Second Amendment, the reason why we don't have real gun control laws, real gun safety laws.
Safety laws.
Yes, is because of that fear that I have to defend myself. So I think about Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying for Whiteness, where he does a study and he finds that in rural Missouri, folks who have had gun violence in their families are in a support group, and they're talking about they don't want gun safety laws because those people from St. Louis will come down here and try to take everything that we have. This is the only thing that we have to defend ourselves and defend our property. When we have that kind of fear coursing through this society, when we have that kind of dehumanization coursing through the way that we handle voting laws, the way that we handle the basic right to vote, we are in trouble in this democracy. So it requires us to have real history so we can understand the way that anti-blackness has influenced and affected American society. And so that we can begin to dismantle that anti-blackness and really live into the fullness of this nation.
That was wonderful.
I was going to say, that seems like a really nice note to end on.
Absolutely.
And it's always, I mean, Joanne always finishes the show, so I'll just say very briefly that I love working with you guys. I really do. And if anybody is out there still sort of reeling from everything we just threw at you, when we were planning this, we all went down a rabbit hole. I don't remember what it was. And finally, one of the producers says, guys, that's a different show. So it may be that we get to do all this all over again. And I don't even remember what the topic was, but it was like, this is great. Let's talk about this. And they're like,
that's not
this week, folks. Let's pull it back in.
I'll just very quickly say thank you all for being here. I actually have a mug that says, thank you for engaging in democracy every Friday morning, which relates to my webcast. But by sitting here and talking about these issues, we are engaging in democracy by raising awareness and thinking about the meaning of what's happening now and how it does or doesn't, in our case, how it does erode democracy. So thank you for being here for this. Thank you, Carol, so much. We said at the beginning of this, Heather and I, that like, it's funny, we're not nervous. And the reason we weren't was because it's so fun, the group of us being here together. So thank you, Carol, for coming back. Thank you, folks, for being here. And we will, see you. You'll hear us next week on Now and Then.
And thank you.